Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming tonight for this very special evening. My name is Sonia. I work here at the gallery, and it is my absolute pleasure to introduce our two legendary speakers tonight. Firstly, Catherine Zegher, brilliant art historian and curator, who's also the curator of this exhibition that you can see all around you, called Women's Work Is Never Done, which is titled after Catherine's anthology published in 2014. It's a fabulous book that we have copies of at the front desk. And Catherine is joined tonight by Griselda Pollock, renowned art historian, writer, scholar, thinker, the list goes on.
Curator.
Curator, yeah.
Just to join the club.
Yeah. Griselda's recent publications include, and I have a list, Woman in Art, Helen Rosenau's Little Book of 1944, published by Paul Mellon Center in 2023. Killing Men and Dying Women, Imagining Difference in 1950s New York Painting, published by Manchester University Press in 2022. And Charlotte Solomon and the Theater of Memory, published in 2018 by Yale University Press. And Griselda, I wanted to mention, was also recently awarded the CAA Distinguished Lifetime Achievement Award for Writing on Art in 2023, amongst many other awards and publications. So yeah, we're going to be starting the talk in a few minutes. At the end, there will be some time for questions as well. And it will also be recorded, so it should be available on our website very soon as well. Yeah, without further ado, I will hand over. Thank you both so much for joining us. It's really an honor. So yeah, thank you.
So, thank you. So, given the shape of the room, and given that women have very quiet voices and tend not to speak up, could you please agitate from the back if you're not hearing well? And then maybe certain people could exchange places with certain other people sort of halfway through to allow some people to sit down. You might cause a little bit of things, but we could sort of be very communal about this, if you could. So I am going to just start, because as the sort of chair of this, the person who's going to start the conversation, first of all to thank Sonia for organising it and doing such a beautiful and gentle job in managing several slightly crazy ladies, myself being the leading one of them, who managed to buy the tickets to go back to Leeds rather than to come to London, which was a little, she was very gentle about that. But secondly, obviously, to Richard Saltoun for hosting this exhibition and enabling a kind of reunion of several of us, artists who were in the original Inside the Visible show, one of whom is Bracha Ettinger, who's here, but also particularly reunions with Catherine de Zegher, because we have been in conversation on different kinds since the early 1990s. And indeed, in preparing for this, I went back down memory lane, which I won't bore you with, but it was because of a series of events, because I met Bracha Ettinger. I was interested in her work. I went to Paris, and then on the way she said, well, you must go and see my work up in Courtrai, or Courtrai, and off my poor little daughter, who was dragged everywhere with me and now doesn't like going to art galleries a great deal. She travelled with me very gently, and we went to Catherine's house and sat, and you know, I'm sure you have that experience when you meet somebody and you think, well, we're in tune, this is going to be lovely, as opposed to going to knocking on somebody's door saying, I'm very pleased to meet you, and, you know, come to things. So we've been in conversation, obviously, since that date, and we're going to kind of follow it through in certain kinds of ways, because we're starting at the end, and I'm very glad to see that Catherine's book, which are all beautifully designed, if any of you are into book designs, her book design is rather remarkable. I think it's thicker than any book I've ever written, so it's more of a doorstopper. So she wins. She definitely wins in this, but it's packed with years and years and years of research that she delivered in terms of artists who just happen to be women. Now, I would like to say, I do not talk about women artists, because the minute you talk about women artists, they cease to be artists. And I have been carrying around a beautiful bag by Patricia Conan, who's an American artist, saying, with lots and lots of portraits of artists, and saying, artists crossing out the female. which is what the Americans call. So we have to think about language here, and in some sense, the whole history of the problematic that Katrine and I have been involved in is under what circumstances did artists of a certain sort, in the middle of the 20th century, at the height of modernism, get written out. So it's very important to understand women have never been written out until the middle of the 20th century. They are traced in every archive. You know, everywhere you go, you'll find somebody doing something in ways that are suitable for their time, whether they're nuns in convents or whether they are ladies in waiting at the Spanish court of the various Philips there, or whether they are commissioned to work at the courts of the 16th and 17th century or in the academies, whatever. But something crucial happens, and we are dealing with the fallout of that, which means everybody thinks we're rediscovering them, right? And to be called a rediscovered artist is to insert into language, there must have been a reason why somebody forgot you, right? So we want to work out that, etc. So we have worked with a number of artists whose ways of being in the world and ways of thinking bring something remarkable to the world. That if you are en masse excluded as black artists or queer artists or women artists, prevents the world from having by means of art. So there's a crucial thing of not just adding artists to some canon, but actually understanding why does it matter that all the artists in Katrine's book, A Woman's Work Is Never Done, or in many of her collections, have got a form of presence where you can see them, where you can read about them, but also where you could read certain ways of looking at that work that are not about producing a brand that somebody can sell, that are not about making a career by mentioning lots of names, right? And this takes a lot of work because, as you can see from the exhibition here, you can walk in and say, what's going on here? I don't know, right? Now, Katrine originally was an archaeologist, and that brings to the way she becomes an art historian something very special, which is archaeology is about finding the hitherto invisible or making sense of what you find when you start digging and looking, having to interpret it because it may be in fragments, it may be traces, it may not come to you all nicely packaged with a big Yale University monograph to put as another doorstopper if you want. So the question of feminist curation or writing or thinking has been, and which is I think is in the title of the Inside the Visible, that what has become invisible to us is not by virtue of simple forgetting or overlooking or being bad, but because we didn't have, through a certain kind of discourse, which I'd say a phallocentric, patriarchal, Eurocentric, all these other kinds of discourse, we didn't have a language. So I'd like us to think about this sense of Katrine's curation as about a really remarkable mind, finding through her researches, always with talking to artists, that they are generating, either through their work or through the supplementary activities of their writings about their work or around even theoretical developments, bringing us to ways of thinking that are deeply countering the phallocentric structures of meaning that have so normalized us that we think that if we were going to use the word, say inside the visible, elliptical traverses in, of, and from the feminine, a very large proportion of feminists are going to say, oh my God, not that word, right? And yet we deprive ourselves of the sense that there may be ways of living, ways of seeing, ways of understanding, ways of creating that have individual significance because each artist speaks only in a personal voice. That's one of the few people in the world who are allowed to, right? And if artists speak in a collective voice, we say, oh, you're being political now, you're being ideological. But in fact, the question of the singular voice, but when it becomes a cacophony of singular voices, speaking a lot, we have, and that's why we have an exhibition, where we bring them together, not so that they'll say, oh, there's another little, oh, there's a very feminine nose. Okay, there's a feminine pointy bit. Or is not that. It's to do with what is something that is not yet written, not yet inscribed, not yet recognized, but is there, right? Has been happening, has been being inscribed in various ways. So the kind of framing I want, so if women's work is never done, is one frame. It means we still haven't finished this project. You all can't relax and say, oh, it's fine, you can go down the road anywhere around here and find somebody making millions out of some woman artist who they are now selling, but who was no one until certain people went and looked for them. And I know climbed mountains, not virtually, but up the steep hills of different cities in Latin America to find the studios of women and find them and speak to them and have conversations and make work. So a woman's work is never done. Definitely feminism is an unfinished process. And it is only unfinished because we don't have a full sense of what it is to do feminist scholarship. I was going to say, this is going to sound really silly, it's one thing, but it's one of the lines that people say, I've only been doing it so far for about 50, is that right, 50 years now? And I just think I'm just beginning, right? I've just got myself oriented to actually see things, but without Katrien, and indeed without Bracha, who's also here, I would not have got where I'm going. So one of the works that Katrien thinks, now I did do a PowerPoint which you were meant to be able to pick up on your phones through a thing, but we didn't quite manage that technology. So you'll see me thinking about this, etc. The number of the works of Katrien are extraordinary. The publications from Inside the Visible to Stage of Drawing that she did with Avis Newman. Is that right? That's the one I have to go back and see. Yeah. Artist Compassion, which is a monograph she did on Bracha Ettinger. People saw me holding up this wonderful collection here, which is from 3 years ago. Yeah. Which is a magazine called See All This, which has just, I think, about 35 essays or something like that. It counts up of every artist under the sun, little essays on that, on abstraction, on line, on named particular artists, and amongst whom would be Eva Hesse, Martha Rossler, Julie Meretu, everybody you really would think about. But what do they have in common? Not particularly as artists they have in common, but what Katrien discerns is, in one sense, a kind of ethic, but particularly a question of the, what I'm going to call the kind of drawing a thread. And drawing a thread which will take us to Cecilia Vincunha particularly, not threads, drawings, but works that are therefore not immediately declaring what they are to you. You have to think with them. You have to come in here and say, you know, what's going on? Do I like this? Do I not? You need to sort of see a kind of subtlety and quietude with which the works will yield themselves to a certain kind of long-looking, but looking in the framework in which Katrien has worked. So this now sounds like too much of a one-sided conversation. I'm going to,
no.
But I want to bring this up because I want to start talking to you about one of the places that your work as a curator started. Was in the light of everybody's decolonization at the moment, was this wonderful exhibition called America, Bride of the Sun, which was conceived by Paul van den Broek in terms of the National Museum of Flanders, is it? No,
the Royal Museum in Antwerp.
Okay,
Royal Museum of Fine Arts.
The Royal Museum of Fine Art in Antwerp. And it was at the point of, we were celebrating or not celebrating, indeed questioning 1492. So this exhibition took place in 1992. And you were invited to introduce to this story of the impact of the Spanish world and this world that was the pre-Columbian, pre-Spanish world of Latin America on Europe through the eyes of Belgium and its colonies and things, but to find out about women. So maybe you could start there with how does this exhibition open the space that you've now been working in for so long?
Well, thank you, Griselda, for such a beautiful introduction. America, Bride of the Sun, actually, we never liked this title. We had proposed Ver America, which in Spanish means to see America, and Ver in Flemish means far America. So we were looking with an exotic eye.
Can you all hear back there?
Yes. We were looking with an exotic eye, actually, at South America, and I had suggested to Paul van den Broek, why don't we introduce the work of modern and contemporary artists so that they could actually criticize within the exhibition our looking at America, South America. And so we had a wonderful set of artists, Cildo Mireles, Gabriela Orozco, Ana Maria Maiolino, Cecilia Vicuña, I think 25 artists who did big projects inside the historical exhibition, and which led to sometimes to conflict with the director, who wanted it to be much quieter, but they were so happy to be there, and the staff was actually wonderful. They were cooking for them. Every day was another meal, a Chilean meal, an Argentinian meal, and Cuban meal, and the atmosphere was very, it was not only tense, but it was also, in a way, very collaborative, and so they felt that they really had to fulfill a task that, 500 years of relationship between Latin America and the Low Countries, everybody can say, what is that about? But because we had Jan van Eyck, and he was producing all these works for the King of Spain, and then these works went on ships to South America as a kind of conquista of the mind. So the Flemish primitives, in a way, were part of the conquista of the mind, of the eye, because it was the first time that perspective was sent out in the world in such a way. So for the native population, it was very, it was at the same time scary. It was used, in fact, as our videos used now. It was really, in French, there is a writer, I can't remember his name now, he speaks about la guerre aux images. So it was really a battle of imagery. It was who has the strongest imagery, who can conquer the mind, because it was not enough to conquer the land and to subject the people, but they also wanted to conquer the mind. And so the paintings were used in that way. Of course, the politicians in Flanders were not very happy with that interpretation of our role in South America. But the works went from Flanders through Spain to South America and were used in that way. So we needed a kind of counterbalance.
Of Latin American voices speaking back to it.
To speak back to us. And the best way to do that is to invite artists. Not to invite historians, but to invite artists who look at us and who also look at their history and who can answer such a proposal.
Because it's quite important, because people who are not historians do not realize that until a very late point into the end of the 16th century and then into the 17th century, that what is now what you call the Low Countries, including Holland, were under the Habsburg monarchy of Spain, right? Yeah. Spain was the great monarchy of Europe, getting richer and richer from the silver that it brought over. And whenever you go to any European churches and you see all this beautiful kind of Catholic silver across every church, just your mind has to travel back to Peru to sink the mines and what were going on there. So I love this sense of reversing the gaze.
Yeah, it was really reversing the gaze.
And people probably not realizing that, Van Eyck, that they might be looking up in the National Gallery, is one of the instruments of this kind of ideological conversion.
Yes.
And
also they were superposing the Virgin and the Child onto the Pachamama. So they were trying to erase the imagery that existed and impose another imagery. I mean, it happens. It still happens today. It's the same technique. It's you need, and we still need the critical eye of artists to make us aware of that.
Okay, so that's a very important aspect in the sense that the artists are not, as it were, counter-propaganda, but they're engaging, because also the other thing about Latin America, which I think is important to bring in, which is they're some of the earliest post-colonial societies, so that I know when I go to Argentina and they say we got independence in 1828, so we've been trying to negotiate post-coloniality for a couple of centuries. So I think once you skew that and bring in Latin America, and in many other ways, in many of the other artists, you'll find also you're working with countries that get put to the margins even within Europe, because you're bringing in you, home is the Low Countries, but we said how many Belgian and Dutch artists can any of you name? You'd still find them saying, Mondrian, but don't mention the one with the beginning with V and second name G. We'll leave that one. So anyway, so there's a number of different things that are already going on, which in your practice then, you keep that sense of having to shift the centers.
Yes, and at the same time, you also have to deal with the history there. There was a lot of dictatorships at the time when these artists were starting to work. In Chile, in Argentina, in Brazil. So that added another layer onto when I was doing my research in South America. So I met with artists who really had to fight and who were still alive. I mean, we had a similar, of course, the Second World and the First World, the Second World more than the First World War. We had a similar history, but not in the way that they had it, but also they were living it, and they were telling me about it, and then they were telling me how they developed their practice to be able to criticize a society and at the same time not being caught, Like one of the artists would make on small leaflets of cigarette paper, would make drawings, very subversive drawings that he could hide in his pockets. So that was also for me something that I tried to then develop.
So sensitivity particularly to the living force of almost contemporary and very deadly and indeed genocidal fascisms, which have run through Latin American history post-1950, for whom the key victims have been young people, young thinkers. Yeah. Right? So this is, I think, also another question of your work being aware of kind of the totalitarianisms and anti-fascism. And this is important because why would you then turn to certain kinds of feminist theories? Why would you need a feminist theory that would be able to identify some kind of deep imaginative or imaginary symbolic system, which isn't enough to say, patriarchal culture or we're fighting sexism. We have to get hold of something which is a structure that captures the mind and recurs in this. So this is going to be my segue into Inside the Visible, because Inside the Visible is one of the most important exhibitions, in my opinion, ever created that can continuously study, because you operate three radical things. First of all, you rewrite the history of the 20th century, centered on what we would call both the feminine and the anti-fascist, even though we'd have to be has to be fascism for you to be anti it, etc. So we're dealing with the 20th century, which typical art history will tell you that there were the movements. They did all of this, and oh, by the way, all these people had to suddenly leave Europe, and oh, a whole bunch of them aren't there anymore. They died, you know, somewhere in Europe because of something about them, but we won't go into it. So all of this sense of how art history smooths over. And as a social historian of art, I was always told I couldn't be an art historian because I brought in this brutal nonsense like politics and history, and you shouldn't mention on which side anybody was. You shouldn't locate it. But by thinking about the 1930s and 40s, the 1960s and 70s, and then the 1990s, you plotted out a different set of moments of crisis and of resistance and of, in a sense, danger, and providing us a way of thinking not of a continuous flow, but eruptions at which we can then locate why artistic practices at certain time became energized, transformed, explosive, you know, regenerative and resistant. But at the same time, your exhibition then found in each of these three sort of temporal zones, these historical generational zones, you discerned, like an archaeologist, little tendencies, focuses, centers of interest or centers of gravity amongst the works that you chose, which were by women, some to do with the question of the body and sexuality, others to do with language and sort of breaking the smooth flow of language. Every time you have this thing, enjambment, I would always just go back, thank goodness Google now, which is, what is enjambment, etc., because I'm not a literary theorist. So it means you break the line when it shouldn't be broken. Is that right? And then La Donna Immobile, which means she's a bit flaky or risky, etc., which was kind of wildness and exotic and now I'm going to forget number 4, which was...
It had to do with space,
Yeah.
With Katarzyna Kobro and Veronika Janssen.
Yeah, okay, so that's already a very interesting model. All of those who've come through art school or history of art, you know, where you've got ism after ism after ism, you take it apart, you just say, art is happening in different constellations of crisis in different places, and what happens if we have moments where we're going to go to Poland as well as Venezuela that are going to coincide, because then you're also going to give this, what I came on later on to call the generations and geographies. How do you hold these two axes? So obviously I have to say thank you very much, because I probably derived it from exactly from
Well, I
looking
derived my title from your text, so...
Okay, we're going to be very sweet about that in a minute, I'm sure. But anyway, now this is gone. So could you say a little bit more about the history of the your formation, which comes from a previous set of exhibitions that you produced called Begin the Begin. So you'll have to explain. Although it's a Cole Porter song, Begin the Begin, so we can all sing along, but it's nothing to do with that.
Well, it's it's actually very simple. I had developed the exhibition, and then I was presenting it to several institutions in Belgium who didn't want to show it. So I was a bit desperate. And on a trip, I met with Sally Stein in Los Angeles. And she said, but why don't you do it in your small city? You find a place which is where women were, you know, free and unbound. And I thought, oh, okay, the Beguinage in Kortrijk, which was a place in the around the beginning of the 13th century that was created, I think, by Johanna of Constantinople for women who were seen actually as unruly. They were not religious and they didn't want to get married. So they were a bit in between and they didn't really know what to do with them. But they were caretakers, social workers, in fact. So they couldn't really reject them. Although it is true that many begins were burned, ended up on the
Stake.
On the stake, yes. So I thought, okay, that's maybe a good place to begin. And so I started in the space each time linking two artists. Avis was one of the artists, together with Anna Maria Maiolino. Mona was an artist, together with Diana Starbuck. So I did the whole, Bracha was there together with Nancy Spiro. So there was a whole group of artists, I think 10, or was it?
Bracha Ettinger, Mona Hatoum, Anne Veronica Janssens, Anna Maria Maiolino, Avis Newman, Martha Rossler, Nancy Spiro, Jana Sterbeck, Joël Terlinks, and Cecilia Vincugna.
Yes. And what was very nice, because they were there for some time, we had very long conversations, and I became more and more aware that there was something southering that needed to really be pronounced in a large-scale exhibition. And the need for not only a visual language, but also a textual language. So I also was reading Julia Kristeva, I was reading Bracha's work, who came with this very important theory of the matrixual. And so we were more and more all linked in a certain way, and we were really trying to put something in language where that didn't exist. You know, you have the phallic, but you don't have anything else. So I think that was very important. What Bracha did is juxtapose to the phallic the matrixual. Bracha can speak about this more in length, but it's really, the phallus next to the matrix. It's not that we wanted to eliminate the phallic, but we wanted to be there as well, so we're alongside. And when you have this group of women who, we had a lot of talks together, and so I was trying actually to bring my excitement to a larger public, because I thought this is really important. It's very important that there is a kind of feminine language. I must say I was never attracted to art that was very violent. I'm more attracted to art that is caring, that is healing, that is domestic, that is really, taking into account or using other elements in life than competition or destruction. Or, for me, the radical is the relational. And I think that was the difficulty of articulating that. And so that is actually at the basis of Inside the Visible.
So I'm going to read a little quotation which helps, which is in the documents that I've found in the Boston Museum of, was it the Boston?
Boston, yeah. ICA Boston.
The ICA, the Institute of Contemporary Art, to which you proposed it, in which it says, this exhibition considers the impact of women artists on art produced in the 20th century. The exhibition title is derived from the invisible axis of work done by women that contributes to important art movements, but is itself never named or categorized. Through the investigation of this invisible area, parallel to the main axis of established art history, the exhibition attempts to constitute a counter-memory. So it's not an adding in, it's not, here, let's insert them in, but that there is another memory of the history of the 20th century if you start from that point of view. And that's obviously why, in a sense, I think we'll say a little bit about this, that this is the point at which the axis of Bracha Ettinger and Kathleen de Zegher and I intersected, because having met Bracha because somebody told me to look at an artist who was interested in psychoanalysis, so I did, but what she gave me was her paper Matrix and Metamorphosis, and from that moment I have never stopped believing that this is one of the most radical interventions that everybody needs to get their heads around. It's challenging, it requires quite a lot of engagement with psychoanalysis that most of us don't have because we haven't entered the domain of this wonderful language that deals with the psyche. But what is interesting to think of is how you mobilize that curatorially, how you, and it's so with the Inside the Visible is another wonderful book stopper to love about, but it has this beautiful essay by Bracha, no, by Catherine, a beautiful essay by Bracha, and then my role, in a sense, is to mediate between the people who would never come across either approaches, because I try to understand where people are, where they will find it difficult to make that crossing to cross the bridge. Like I was thinking of Venice, you know, there's a little bridge you have to cross to get to a little other floating piece. And the history of feminism, history of intellectual tendencies is there's people cluster on certain islands which they think are the center of the universe and aren't prepared to make that various kinds of journeys. So I see that catalogue as the monument to a certain moment where, in a sense, the three of us in different ways came together, an artist with this wonderful sense of how to shift the phallus, not to knock it out, not to put it away, but in a sense to move something which is already there, but was not theorized by the French feminists. It was not the feminine of Julia Kristeva or Lucy Irigaray. But this is where I came up with this idea, which is also owes something to Mary Kelly, of inscriptions in, of, and from the feminine, that something is inscribed
I took that from Griselda.
into art. So you can see, so she took a bit of that, and we took a bit of her, and this is another example of a very crucial moment. And I just want to say that it was in the visit when I came to Kortrijk to see Bracha's work and met you at that point, so this sounds anecdotal, that you also showed me the book on Charlotte Zalman,
yes,
that then captured me. I thought, I saw this work and I thought, which you were showing Inside the Visible. And I spent then 15, well, no, actually more than that, almost 20 years. So what you can add, I can't do 1992 to 2018, obsessing about this till I finally delivered this great lump of a book. But it's so thanks to you, etc., thinking about that. But that's what it requires to work out how to see works that everything in your culture has invisibilized, because all the terms you've got are blocking its access to you. So another quotation I want to ask you to comment, which is, this exhibition is structured around three periods in the 20th century, and I've given you 30s, 40s, 60s, 70s, and 90s. So that's a different feminist temporality. Each of these periods anticipated moments of political turmoil and often stimulated artistic production that redefined artistic practice. And historical motivation of the exhibition is to present the motion of recurrent cycles evidenced by similar work produced by artists in different parts of the world during different time genealogies. So this is kind of awesome because, you know, we clarify, Americans and French and, you know, Venezuelans, but how could something be happening in these different cycles with indifference that nonetheless we could find this, we could draw the threads which would give us a different kind of language. So you say that rather than a linear survey of established genealogies, the convergence revealed by the exhibition, so you haven't set it up and said, go from here to here. Something will happen, and you have to do some of that work. You have to discern something which is not carried in your head because as what you were taught is what you're meant to do when you see. And our artists, of course, do this all the time. They are completely chaotic. Put an artist in the gallery, an art historian is trying to say, no, we're going from here to here, and then we'll see. But no, you know, kind of, it's like a wonderful crisscross of understanding, and no artist is confined to her century or his century. You know, Titian is as homely to somebody making a mark on canvas today, like Helen Frankenthaler, you know, has got Titian in her mind in New York in the 1950s, 70s, but we don't want to go on down that one. The convergence has revealed that while situated within largely patriarchal and imperialist cultures, independent women's voices have often intervened to challenge the status quo. So the other aspect of the feminine that we are trying to formulate here, what you were trying to formulate, and Bracha's trying to formulate, is not just abject and, you know, oppressed and sneaking things, but it actually is a critical challenge. It's a resource that we need. And it's so interesting how so anxious the world is for anybody to say that I think we have been policed. I think people have not listened to the possibility because we are so schooled into thinking that any kind of claim of this kind, and this is the deadliest critique you can make of any feminist, it's essentialist.
Yeah, excellent.
So a whole, you know, generation, a whole kind of bunch of us, you know, kind of 52% of us have suddenly, by virtue of trying to say maybe we have something to say, we have fallen into a category of all saying the same thing, which is complete nonsense. So that one's out of the way. And then you say, so women have often intervened to challenge the status quo. Inside the Visible will feature the work of international artists, and you give the list. The traditional methods of museum display which aim to fix meanings through ordered presentation and didactics will be subverted in an effort to heighten the visceral connections explored throughout the exhibition. So we've talked about trying to find a language in which to allow something to become visible, to peek into the visible, but also this requires not using certain languages, curatorial, exhibitionary, but also allowing us to engage viscerally.
Yeah.
So maybe you could talk a little bit about that phrasing.
Well, I obviously traveled a lot, but I was always struck by convergences. You know, like at certain moments, similar things happen in different places in the world. And you can also see this in time. So that's why I'm thinking more, I think we evolve more in a cyclic way than in a linear way. So how can you make those convergences as a curator visible? It's mostly through, well, you work with visual art. So it's lines, it's color, it's content, it's... So many things have to fit together in a way, have to make an... I hope I have done this in this exhibition too. When you can bring these things together through time and through space, then you see a different story evolving, a different way of seeing, a different way of thinking. And, you know, to most existing systems, it will look it will be seen as irrational or chaotic, but once you immerse yourself in it and you really, it all happens between you and the works, and then it also happens between the works. You create a space where it's where things can become apparent that are not immediately visible. And I think that's art working. You know, that's how art works. It works, of course, we participate in a big way. And it works, you know, if you go to the National Gallery, which I have just done, we see things and we, like I think a lot of the paintings of the Virgin and the Child is like what we're speaking about, the matrixual. You know, it's trying to put compassion in the world, love in the world, other ways of seeing, of perception in the world. Yeah, the way I worked was I looked at a lot of work, of historical work by women in the early 20th century. And then, for example, I was looking at the notion of the abject. So, an artist like Carol Rama, how was she able to make that work in the 30s and the 40s, you know, when fascism is really developing in an incredible way? How was she able to work? Then you have Louise Bourgeois later on, all these artists who were working with this, which is very threatening for a fascist society. So they were using, so I think the visceral is also very threatening.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the way you subvert things, not by being very clear and open and like, let's go for that. I mean, some women have been incredible, heroic, but I think art works on another level and is more indirect, but it goes very deep.
Mm. I'm going to just take one more point and then we'll have some questions, which is one of the, I call it drawing a thread, but you're obviously in your work with Avis Newman on the collections of drawings in the Tate, and in some sense drawing, and I read one comment by somebody about one of your exhibitions, which they went in and they said, oh, there's just lots of marks on pieces of paper. And then they, and they said, but by the time you actually spend time with it, you see what marks they are, what, that the time it takes to see work that does not hit you in the face, that has a kind of understatedness, but it requires, which is a theme that I think I also have derived from working with you and with Bracha. Two things I'll pick up. One is the question of paying attention to what the legacies of the modern in art was, which was suddenly realizing that the things you used to make your art according to something that had cultural significance, whether that was theology or history or the real or socialism, whatever, that it itself was sufficient. So I'm really interested in sort of not dismissing this extraordinary generativity of the moment when people said, your medium, fidelity to your medium is a way we break through a sort of a tutelage to something else outside of art. Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean you escape from the world, because increasingly, of course, we read quite a lot of abstract art. But in a sense, I think what you also carry from your study of all these artists, how line particularly, which is different from, we think about paint or we think about sculpture, you get taught about all of those things, etc. But your particular thing is line and mark and gesture and a particular kind of sensitivity to the more ephemeral materialities of paper or drawing. You see it in Bracha's work, you see it in even sort of work that's sort of kind of prints where you still leave the physicality of this. And here. And I was listening to a talk the other day about Marlowe Moss, the absolutely spectacular early 20th century, I don't know his instance, but sort of constructivist whose work has disappeared in relation to somewhat, Mondrian is fine, but a bit colourful for me. But she has this correspondence with Mondrian over months and months about 2 lines, just putting 2 lines on a piece of paper, right? And if you look up Marlowe Moss, and you'll find that extraordinary systematic exploration over drawing after drawing after drawing, painting after painting after painting, of what happens just when you put not just 1 line, okay, because you get a vertical or a human being or a bisection or a geometry, etc., but 2 lines, okay, which is two-ness, right? Now, what is the most central figure of most compositions and in our lives, which is, okay, there's the solitary, but the two-ness, and whether it's the mother-child two-ness, or whether it's not just the mother and child two-ness, but in something that Bracha has tried to talk about, that we never had, from the moments we had any sensation in our beings registered as a sentient being, there was more than oneness, even if it was unknown. And so when you gave the title to the book that we both edited on Bracha's work as an artist, and you said, I think I remember this conversation that you were going to, Bracha said, you were so touched, but you had said, I think your art is about compassion, which of course is a theme, com-passion, to be with, and then compassion, which takes us back to where we began, which is what would it be if we had a whole history of art written with the work of this part of the universe that has been labeled woman. with all the complexity, diversity, historical specificity, and the legacies of what changed art in the 20th century, which was both a way of seeing it which enabled us to go back and see the work that had served the church or served empire in slightly different ways, etc. So I think it's an interesting and important thing that we end on, that it matters that we have these thoughts. Don't get caught up in debates about whether we can use that word or we can't use that word, or that the feminine is absolutely the last word that should be used at the moment. And you say to yourself, how did it get that we would find that we would be so afraid of just saying, maybe there's something there that might actually help us counter murderousness, fascist mentalities, militarism, sexual predation, planetary devastation. So we got the answer here, see, for everything we need to sort out. No, we don't. But we need to think, but you have taught us to say we need to think it in with the artists, because they take us to places.
Yeah, it's the same with drawing. I mean, I got into the job of being the director of the drawing center, but I got more and more. I think the drawing chose me. I didn't choose drawing, but it was also seen as a subservient medium. It wasn't considered until recently. It was really like, okay, that's okay, drawing. And when I spoke with a lot of artists, and Avis is definitely one of them, she told me, she reminded me of this beautiful story where, is it the daughter of Butades, who, when her lover is leaving, she draws the shadow on the wall. So for me, that was really, it became clear that actually drawing is about love and is about trying to find also the lost duality, like you say, two lines. It's trying to be at the same time attached and detached. It's the moment of independence, still being dependent, but independence. So it's such a beautiful medium that allows us to come into being. And I think that's where I got more and more, as you can see. Actually, Katie, who worked with me at the drawing center, worked on all these drawing papers, and we all the time found another way of, describing drawing or working with drawing. And it's, this desire to leave a mark, but also to leave, it's about I exist, but it's even more about I exist with. I exist with the other. I exist with the surrounding world. It's again about relation. It's about a relational. And I think drawing, and I try to do this in the exhibition online, where I could see that during the 20th century, the notion of the linear, which was very patriarchal, phallic structure, in fact was being very often undermined by the work of women through weaving. One of the ways they got to the grid was through weaving. It's not always acknowledged, but like the work in Eva Hesse, it's very clear that she was working with weaving, but she would never say that, because you couldn't say.
It's a good modernist time.
Yes, you couldn't. She wanted to be in the world like all the minimalist artists, but she didn't really want to use their language, but she also couldn't say that it was weaving because it would be related to craft. So she was trying to transcend all these categories. And so it's always about how can we transcend this and how can we bring another model into the world, another model of coexistence. And so that's how in online I came to the web, actually. We had a big discussion at MoMA about the title because they said everybody will be confused. I said, yes, but Kandinsky wrote the book online, you know. Of course, he couldn't know what that would mean at the end of the century, but it's so interesting to see how he's already speaking of a point in movement. So a lot of the work I'm dealing with is about movement, is about changing perception, is about transcending categories. So drawing is a very good medium to do that.
Well, thank you. I'm going to leave it there and see if we can have some chance of you who sat so silently and beautifully and enabled the sound of Catherine to come. Isn't that interesting that almost your bodies have silenced themselves so that her voice is carried, I hope, enough.
Because I have a very low voice.
But I would like to see if people would like to join in and ask questions to Catherine or say something. So this is your chance. Anybody wish to join our conversation? Don't feel you're standing up and asking questions, just joining.
Yes.
Thoughts, responses?
I have a question. How do you find something that's invisible?
Yes. Well, I think it's very nice how Griselda started the conversation. You know, as an archaeologist, you never know what you will find. You know, it's always invisible. It's under the ground. It's I guess I'm attracted by what is not immediately commonly accepted. I think there are other things somewhere out there which are not immediately visible, and that's what I'm attracted to.
And I just want to add that. So this, I think, thank you for that question, because it is, and what is could be inside the visible or inside the invisible. But we're aware that the things that structure us in our literally our looking, right? I mean, that there is a psychological dimension of what we want to see, what we desire to see, what we do with seeing things, etc. But also it's clear, you know, that it is possible not to see. It can be always right there, but it is effectively invisible. It's invisibilized by, you know, cultural prejudices, by racism, by things. And that's this thing, I think, of working to challenge the structures of invisibilization. And you raised the question, and it comes up very early in the catalogue and Inside the Visible, when you invoke the matrixial gaze, which is a lecture that Brache gave actually in Leeds in 1994, which I published as a little booklet, because it's saying, okay, there are, you know, in the sense, a phallic gaze, you know, looks to see something and is therefore in a structure of, in sense, control or power or domination, etc. But what would be if there's another kind of gazing, which, of course, in one sense, needs a psychoanalytical theory to get us away from ocularity and opticality and all of those things. But at the same time is what we already know, because when you're talking about, you know, even the sense that you go into an exhibition and you spend time with it, with the works, you know, what happens to you, again, then Brache has talked about this in sense, almost as you lay down your, do I like this? What is this? You know, who's it by? You know, where does it fit? You know, all those kinds of armored anxieties when you're confronted with what perplexes you. You can lay down your gaze, like, as Lacan said, you lay down your weapons, and you take time for, you know, not in sense for it's not magically working upon you, etc., but you have to look in a different way, which is allowing something that was invisible to you, this is a piece of paper or this is just a line, to actually work out this. I mean, I suppose all of us who do art history or teach art history is how to work out how this is working, you know, how does this do something in its activities on a piece of paper, even if it's just one line or two lines, or something that looks very fragmentary. It takes.
Yeah, and that's also why I like working with artists, because they actually see things that we don't see. A lot of the work, brings about things that we don't immediately see.
Yeah, I mean, because often when I was teaching fine art and you'd go into the studios and you just think, where on earth did that come from? 2 days ago, there was somebody messing around, and there was I remember one student who'd obviously seen a Sarah Lucas exhibition and had some of, concrete blocks, and I thought, oh dear, somebody's told him actually to go and see Sarah Lucas. And about 3 days later, I trundled by, because I had a walkway that went through the studio to my office, and I thought, wait a minute, what's happened? Because suddenly you think, I'm looking at a work. There's some internal economy that has happened here, which is no longer anything to do with Sarah Lucas and that sort of stuff, etc. But what was that then suddenly was something that I thought, where, and I frequently had that sense, which is, the endless soul. How did that suddenly configure in such a way that it holds something that is going to hold my gaze for a while to try and see what is happening here, right? Not what is this, but what is happening here? What is it doing?
It happened, very often when I was walking with Martha Rosler through the streets in New York. She would absolutely see things I had passed by so many times, and she would see things that I had never seen. But all the time, not like once, very often. The same with Nancy Spiro. They see unremarkable things, but they see it, and that it trains your eye. It's like an exercise for your eyes. And then you see more and more, and of course you become more and more critical at the same time. Because, like you said, we're so fed with. And nowadays even more, all this imagery coming to us constantly, that we really need art and artists to do this for us, to look at it, being able even to look at it critically.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that's a long answer.
It's a question from Margaret.
I've been looking at who's rubbing behind you. They had like a corona, and also at the back of the room, there's, I don't know if that's the plant rubbings, and I wondered if rubbings, frottage, has a special place in your...
Yes, I think, when I made Ocean Flowers, there was a book about how the competition, not the competition, I don't call it competition, it was about the interaction of all kinds of mediums in the area of work on paper. And you have impression, you have rubbing, you have all these, possibilities of making work, and then the photogram, and so yes, I think frottage, actually, the work of Simran Gill, she works a lot with frottage, is how do we capture reality, how can we deal with something, with memory. The frottage is often used. I mean, the surrealists used it in a very creative way. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I link to the question that was asked there about the invisible. And I think that in this show and in Inside the Visible, it's quite clear also that you relate not only to art history and not only to, but you relate deeply to a question that are philosophical questions all over 20th century and even 19th century. We think that the invisible is not possible. It's either visible or we cannot talk about the invisible in the visible. But in fact, most of the things you work with and then the artists you choose are working with are about the transformation from invisibility to the visible, because even idea idea is something which is invisible. There's a lot of things that are invisible, and then they get some forms of visibility. They could have received other forms of visibility. But I'm saying that in order to emphasize something that is very important that you have been doing and Griselda has been doing for millions of years, is that art history is full of political agendas and Marxist thinking and political, the German thinking of the Frankfurt School and so on and so on. And you bring in philosophy in a different way and psychoanalysis. And one of the interesting things was on the 3 dimensions of the 3 periods of psychoanalysis, the period of Jean Rivière, the feminine, since we couldn't speak about the feminine, it was not possible, was the masquerade. What was femininity? A masquerade to the phallic body and concept, right? This was very rooted in psychoanalysis at that period. Because people were afraid to think essence, we don't know what it is. By the way, we don't know what it is. But so masquerade. And when this faded out, Kristeva and the object, they reject the revolutionary moment. We need that in order to establish subjectivity. The other, whatever I reject, whatever rejects me, etc. And then the moment of compassion, which is then the co-emergence, which I think is, I mean, we have to continue to think in that way. What is the feminine? And why in psychoanalysis the feminine and the maternal were so split? So you're either a Madonna who looks after a child, or you are a sexual being. Most of your artists reject that partition without formulating it, even without saying we reject it. But if we think about the feminine, we look at philosophy, it's always either you are a mother, or you are a subject, or you are a woman, etc. And all these categories that both your proposition refuse right from the beginning. And the way you use these 3 periods in the exhibition, now and then, was for me wonderful, because you didn't say the artists of the 30s work in a way that would resemble what Jean Rivière said. And the artists of the 70s, you showed that all of this is already invisible, unthinkable before. And it is artists were mixing these trends unknowingly or knowingly, and not by. And that's one of the purposes, I think, or the raison d'être, that it was non-linear. You mixed periods, you drew lines for the viewer to look and forget about those as if it's a real period in history. So I think this is a very curatorial gesture, which is very remarkable.
Well, I also, if we consider the last room, now it's all over ecofeminism, but a lot of women artists were working a long time ago on this. Because, and they will say we are essentialists, because the earth is linked, philosophically, psychologically, with woman. But it's true that a lot of artists have been working since a long time, which is now only becoming visible in a way. And I would even say that they anticipated, they worked on the fact that our society would finally see what is necessary to save the planet, basically. So like Cecilia Vicuña, so that for me is also what the invisible is, like trying to understand what is, because often they don't know, Anna Maria always said to me, don't write about my work, because then I can't do any work anymore, because I don't know how I do my work. So it's, and then it needs, you know, it needs this fact that you look back and forward to understand what, I think the fact that now we're speaking about ecofeminism and about the planet is for a big deal, to, thanks to artists who've been working on this for a very, very long time. Before, even in the 70s, when it was coined by Françoise
Daubonne,
Daubonne,
exactly.
what a name,
She
huh?
wrote a book called Le Féminisme ou la
Or
Mort,
la mort,
Feminism or Death.
yes.
And we just didn't read it. Right? Somehow it was, I mean, it wasn't translated, but I mean, she was there in this, and she was
Yeah.
also writing a book in 74 called L'Histoire de l'art et la lutte des sexes,
Yeah.
History of Art and Sex Struggle, Gender Struggle.
Yeah.
She
We all
was,
have to read it now.
yeah, we know, I mean, you know, that's where someone was missed, and then at the moment that of our need, they come that forward. And I think it's an interesting thing, because ecofeminism of all the feminisms is more torn apart
Yeah.
by the fear that saying any proposition between something called the feminine and life is going to fall into a particular hole, and I use that advisedly. But it is, I think, significant that we are witnessing such a sort of cultural increase in violence against women, such a risk to women, and so it lies such dimensions of this, and the silencing of the possibility that there is something of a different ordering of the sets of relationships between life and subjects and the world. And it's not that there's something growing inside women because we don't know. The whole point is that's the invisible. We don't know what, historically we talk about, we don't know, if we don't study what women, people who think themselves women, inscribe into culture, we won't know what it is that is, because we've given narratives which create this level of anxiety. So I think that's one of the things about your show, which was to dare to say inscriptions in, of, and from, which is...
Yeah. Covering a large area.
Well, it's that art writes something into the script of culture, but it may not be legible unless we have other processes by which we provide it with the frame of its legibility. Now, one of them might be psychoanalysis, another might be ecofeminism, another might be theories of the abject and things, but these are all contributions to a 20th century investigation into these key questions, and they correspond with major movements in philosophy, from Bergsonian materialism to phenomenology to...
Yes, for example, there are two artists here who are very involved, Ulrika Spare and Natalie Taylor, with the soil and with rocks. For me, it was like when I met with Ulrika, I was thinking, how can you record rocks? But it was to bring in the non-human next to the human. And now, for me, a landscape speaks more to me than it did before. Because you become aware that everything is living, basically. And that, I think, is, again, a contribution of artists, definitely to my life. Also, there are two beautiful films here. And Natalie works with the soil, they open our eyes, basically, and they've been opening them for a very, very long time. And now we're all like, okay, we have to save the planet, but I can... we have to thank these artists who worked for a long time to that.
the key question is the planet is not going to save us.
No.
It could do quite well without us. I think that's a very important element of this, that we are not the guardians and gods
Exactly.
of an environment, but we are abusers in some sense, but abusing ourselves in the process as well.
I was once speaking to Giuseppe Pinoni, and I said, well, that's the end of the world. And he said, no, the world will go on. We may not be there, but the Earth, planet Earth, is
well, the
going
Earth
on.
was, the dinosaurs aren't here, but the Earth is still here.
Yes.
Remember that one.
But we won't end on that tone. So we need another question now.
Is it now time?
Oh, there's another. Griselda, there's another question.
Okay, and
I have a question. I just want to talk about the body. I haven't seen the show yet, so I'm waiting to see. But how you feel about, I don't want to say the female gaze, the male gaze, but the idea that our gaze is built from all of the things you talked about. It's constructed from a male gaze, and how artists can not break it, but change it. Is there a, how do you feel about that?
About the body as...
Well, just the female representation of the body, the idea of self-portraiture, how we express the invisible, what's below the body.
Yeah, it was one of the important chapters in Inside the Visible, like with Claude Cahun, with Yayoi Kusama, with all these artists who were, of course, extending our perception of the female body. I think I have, I see it more now in relation to the earth. But it was a very important step, of course, at that time, and it still remains an important step, because we should not forget that maybe feminism is developing, but if you think of all the other countries, like,
visual culture, it's
in the world, there's still,
it's still not where maybe art has got to.
Yes. So it's definitely a subject that has to be continued to be developed. But that's it's different. It's different probably in Saudi Arabia and in Pakistan and in India than it is here.
I'm going to just intervene in a very terrible academic way, which is there is no such thing as the male gaze. It was unfortunately used once by Laura Mulvey in an essay which is all about saying there is no such thing.
Yes.
There can be a certain masculinization of...
That's why I want to use those words.
But it's important because maleness and femaleness, then we're all in a mess about what that is at the moment, which I won't even go to. My daughter says, do not talk about that one. Okay, do not talk. Okay, but obviously, in a sense, we need that psychoanalysis gave us incredible tools to understand how the investment of vision as one of the instruments by which we grasp the world. Okay, so, gripping things, etc., sucking things, spitting things out, etc., and then this extraordinary, highly developed ocular system which we have, which becomes a way, and that this is then invested, psychically invested, with a number of interesting phenomena which are either pleasurable or unpleasurable, etc. So there's a whole structure there, and I think that's where one of the things I feel is that between psychoanalysis and film culture, and I always used to give a very long seminar on Laura Mulvey's very beautiful structuring of, and I can give you the reference, I actually wrote this all out, of her chapter, which is about how does it end up that certain investments in vision can become either narcissistic or voyeuristic or erotic or, in a sense, negative, murderous, right? So that's why we have to break that down, and what system sustains and reproduces that in us, an apparatus of that, in certain sense. And that's made huge problems precisely to say what happens when we move then into, can I represent myself? What is this body? And I think we have not solved that in any sense, but we probably need not to allow ourselves to slip in this new age into saying we don't need to go through that difficult work of plotting this out through, I mean, as I mentioned, Bergson or phenomenology. You know, what does it mean to say I'm flesh with the world, and not to see I'm a delineated thing? You know, where is my body, right? And so much artwork has displaced that configured body, and yet there was a moment for feminists to claim, I need to configure myself, I need to make myself visible. But then you run into all this other stuff that's happening in the gazing. And so I think there are these different theories of the sort of, from the classic Freudian and Lacanian, that even that is another kind of gaze, which I can't even begin to tell you how complicated it is, but Brackle. Yeah, but I promise you, if you sit down and read the matrixial gaze, you will get one of the coherent accounts of what the Freudian and the Lacanian gaze, and then in a sense what might be another gazing, which maybe is already happening in the artworks that do not produce that particular set of psychic structures that Freud so clearly named in his study of the sort of eroticization of the gaze. And I think that's where there's a lot more to be said about this. I don't know if you want to say something.
I would only say that it's incredible because the idea of the phallic gaze, the male gaze, I think it's time that we allow ourselves to think other forms of gaze without thinking that we have to reply to the phallic or male gaze. The matrixial gaze is around for 30 years, for example. Could be other forms that are already there. Women's work is never done, Catherine likes to say, but we did the work. There's enormous work on trying to figure out a dimension of the matrixial gaze, which do not reject, not accept, not promote, not reply to the phallic gaze, but offering another field. And this was one of the things I think all of us try to make visible another field. And
but it's
from there, and the language is extremely important, and that's why, you know, look at these enormous books these ladies are producing, because we need language, and the terms we have at a certain point are not enough. So artists are there to invent other terms, and philosophers are there,
and indeed artists are there to provoke us by asking what is that they have put into the visible for the moment in material forms. That's one of the things I think about why the studying of art, not, I mean, in the manner that you're doing, which is enabling us to encounter it and puzzle over what it's putting into the visible, which may not be what the artist knows, but I certainly think...
Yeah, it's collaborative, endless web of work.
Yeah.
And one of the things about that question, which could not start even from the phallic or the male gaze, because it starts elsewhere, and is very clear in all the drawing work that Catherine likes to follow, is that it is between this and this and this and that. It's not generalized. But you have to follow it. You have to enter the line, move on, see what happens to you, to the other, and how one transforms itself. And like this kind of thinking about this kind of sphere which is, you know, pregnant, but not with the whole universe, but with whatever it cares for at that, or carries at that moment. And think how words are important, because the idea that, for example, Earth was associated to the maternal, right? Mm-hmm. And the maternal was the thing to reject in psychoanalysis in order that subject will come. The maternal became the trash bin for just anything. So we could really pollute whatever nourishes us. And with the matricial, we say, no, you cannot pollute what nourishes you. You have to care for whatever cares for you. And so we have another kind of possibility to address ecology, not to exploit the land, not to reject it. And really psychoanalysis of 20th century allowed a massive rejection of the maternal and a magic annihilation of the feminine. And so we say, okay, let's not start from that. Let's start from the co-emergence in the matricial sphere of what can be taken care of and then becoming responsible about and witnessing about. And we have a whole conceptual universe that can be used.
Thank you very much.
Everybody has been very patient.
Thank you both.